seats and hopefully have a nice cup of coffee ready for this informative session on CMMC. Is CMMC important for my organization? Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you to our partners, ImageWorks, for helping us put this together so we can provide you this valuable information on a topic that seems to be plaguing the manufacturing industry with all the changes that have gone on out there and people struggling to understand how this applies to them. I am your host, Mike Jafrida, president of Cybersecurity, joined today by Bob Thomas. He is a Cyber AB registered practitioner. We are a Cyber AB registered practicing organization, providing services for manufacturers of all sizes who are struggling with their CMMC journey. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Bob. Thank you for joining us today, and let's talk a little bit about CMMC.
Sounds good, Mike. Thanks very much for the intro and for kicking this off. I would have to expect that most people that are viewing this content or will get a copy of it later for folks that weren't able to join via a link to the recorded version know what CMMC is, but I guess, for folks that don't deal with this every day, the Cybersecurity Maturity Model certification is what is going to be required. It is not as of today, but coming by the Department of Defense for anybody that does work in the defense industrial base. And that's contractors at the highest level, prime contractors, the General Electrics, Northrop Grumman, Lockheed Martin, all those folks, Electric Boat that participate at the highest level and filtered all the way down to the subcontractors that provide the smallest of component parts so they can build whatever they manufacture. I think there's been a lot of questions and I guess misunderstandings about CMMC and what's really different about it. Isn't it just NIST 800-171 repackaged? And I guess we've got a slide later in the deck here that will talk specifically about that and the differences. But it is the next step to really ensuring that data that is shared is properly protected in the defense industrial base. And it's, as I mentioned, it's not just at the top level, but all the way down to the smallest person that paints a part, heat treats a part, and moves it up the food chain. And I think it's important to know that, yes, it is now version 2.0 of CMMC. It's been evolving. Probably folks have seen that. But as of the end of December, and you see the date there, December 26th of last year, the final rule was published. And that doesn't mean it's final, but it releases out for 60 days for public comment. And then there will be another, what they call town hall session, following that to address the comments and decide on what the final rule will look like. And we'll talk about dates in a few minutes as to how they apply here. And, people ask, why should I care about it? And for some people, we talk to folks every day from all walks of life, all different sizes of businesses. And I think, what you need to address yourself, look in the mirror and say, how much of my business comes from the defense industrial base? Because that's what's at risk here. If you are going to be eligible for a contract, you're going to have to be, depending on your level, either level 1 because you're only accessing federal contract information, or if you're dealing with CUI, creating it, accessing it, consuming it in any fashion, you'll need to be at least at level 2. You need to be certified at that level in order to be able to receive a award. There's a comment here: without the appropriate certification level, bidding on or receiving awarded contracts will not be possible. I've read that. I might take that in a slightly different direction. Everything that we've been told in our training as we got associated and registered and certified with the Cyber Accrediting Board has told us, yes, you can bid on these, But if you're not certified, you will never be awarded once this rule goes into effect. That's when the rubber really meets the road and determines whether you're eligible for accepting a contract, providing parts, billing for it, collecting money, being part of the system. You're going to need to be certified at that point. We've even seen, and this is going to sound a little strange, where whether it's NIST 800-171 or people are already getting out in front of the CMMC stuff, saying you cannot even bid on this if you are not, or don't bother bidding on this, is probably a better way to word it, unless you are 800-171 certified, unless you have an SPRS, a supplier provider, risk score. If you don't have those things in place, those are baseline requirements just to get the ball rolling, and then moving into CMMC as the rules are finalized over the next year.
And I think the part to add on to that, Bob,
Yeah.
is that your upstream contractor is looking to protect themselves as well. So for them to put a bid out and accept a bid from someone who is not at least well down the path of compliance, they leave themselves at risk that when that award comes out, if you're not ready with your compliance level to be able to take that on appropriately, they're going to be stuck. So not only is the government pushing this down, but all of the upstream providers are pushing it down to the lower to the downstream contractors as well, because they don't want to get stuck saying, okay, now I'm not compliant because this one piece that I was waiting for from this one contractor who didn't do their due diligence and get their certification put together now throws their whole supply chain out of whack. And so smaller, lower in the food chain contractors are getting pressure not only from the government, but also from their upstream contractors.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Mike, because most of and we've seen piles, literally piles, 6 to 12 inches high of requests for proposals on people's desks, and some of those they've just had to push aside for that exact reason. Is I can think of Pratt and Whitney did this with one of our clients, is they said that don't bother providing a bid if you're not 800-171 certified, if you're not down the road in a reasonable amount of time with CMMC compliance, and you can show that you are securing the data, which is really what everybody's concerned about. So we put together a little chart here that explains the levels. Everybody was used to level 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 with the initial version 1 of CMMC. It's now, after, as you can imagine, a bunch of constructive feedback from suppliers to Department of Defense and the Cyber AB. They've come up with a new list, and this is what it boiled down to with the 3 levels. At level 1, it's federal contract information only, so FCI, based on the FAR 52.204-21 rule. They are concerned about you performing a task in a repetitive manner. They are not so concerned at that level that you have all these written policies, and we're going to get to policies in a minute. They want to know procedurally that you're doing things in a repetitive manner, that it's duplicated over and over, and that you have your eye on the ball. You take that a step farther to level 2, which is probably the lion's share of where contractors and subcontractors fall. It's, we've heard numbers between 70 and 80% of folks fall into this category. You've got access and a requirement to protect CUI. So you're accessing it from your upstream partner. You're potentially flowing it down to somebody else that's also working on the parts that you're intending to deliver. And if you have access to that CUI, you have a requirement to protect it. Those protections are detailed at level 2. Level 3, we're not going to take too much time talking about. That's the prime contractor level. That is the highest, most critical CUI type, and protections are required at that level. those are mostly primes and the very largest of upstream contractors. So in addition to that, we put together you know, a little slide here that I think probably tells a pretty good story about what's coming down the line. And again, at the lowest level, level 1, which they call foundational, that's the expression that they refer to it as far as the level of maturity of your cybersecurity. It is only dealing with federal contract information. As it says in the slide, this is not related to national security data. This only requires self-assessments. This is not outside parties, quote unquote, auditors coming in on a regular basis to verify. This is self-assessment, making sure that you are doing things in a repeatable manner, like I mentioned, but that self-assessment is going to have to be done every year. Then you take the step up to level 2. Now you're dealing with CUI. And because it's CUI and you have a requirement to document how you're dealing with, protect it, have policies surrounding how you're operating, not only are you going to be audited, you're going to be audited every 3 years. And that C3PAO is a certified third-party assessing organization. They are the ones, it's kind of a fork in the road. We're a registered provider organization. We're helping people get certified and get compliant as far as what they have in place for controls, equipment, and processes and procedures. And then the auditors from the C3PAOs come in after the fact and audit that and are checking for evidence. And they're doing that every 3 years. And again, the level 3, very similar. Different organizations auditing is really only the big difference as to who's performing that type of work. So we're going to go through some dates, and this is probably the most important stuff. Yeah, you may see that some of this stuff is not completely firm, but I think you'll understand what's coming down the road, and we're going to show you what that means. So the day that we already talked about, December 26th, quote unquote, final rule. So that's final rule based on version 2 went into this public comment period. And that's about that public comment period ends on Monday, February 26th. So at that date, they're going to cut it off and they're going to say, okay, no more comments. We're going to absorb and comment back on the feedback that we've received. There's the period closing date. And then they're going to have to figure out what the final version of 2.0, the ruling, actually looks like. Now, it sounds crazy that it would take all the way out, a year from now to early 2025. I'm not necessarily going to say that's crazy. What I've heard and all the stuff that I've read in the town halls that I've participated in and viewed, they're talking about September, maybe October timeframe for this. I don't think anybody should bite their fingernails about this, whether it's one date or the other date. It will come, and it will be based on 2.0 with what I would suspect are minor revisions to what that construct, a list of controls, looks like. This is where it becomes key. Once that's published as a final ruling, you're going to see, similarly to how people have put on documents NIST 800-171 certification required, you're going to see CMMC certification level 2 required, level 1 if it's just federal contract information, in order to bid and be awarded these contracts. There won't be any gray area. The waters won't be muddy. You will see definitively this stuff stamped on the front page of every RFP and every award that comes down the line.
And I think, Bob, that's a really important note on this whole CMMC 2.0 release, because how many people do we talk to on a regular basis? Like, we don't know if we have CUI. We don't know if we have FCI. How would we possibly know whether or not what level we have to be at?
Yep.
And so one of the things they're trying to do is get rid of the ambiguity in this rule You know, they're no longer saying there's different kinds of CUI that have different rules around them.
Yeah.
And say if you have CUI, you have to be level 2, and you're going to get an
Period.
assessment every 3 years.
That's
And
right.
it's going to be
Period. You know, and I think, Mike, that's a really good point that you bring up. I think when there's two things, and when you try to compare level, version 1 to version 2 with CMMC, version 1 had some of that ambiguity in it, and I don't think it was tight enough on the wording, but at the same time, they were all it was too structured. And I think that was the feedback that they took from anybody that commented on version 1 and obviously was dissatisfied with what it looked like. They said, oh, well, you either meet the control or you don't meet the control. There was no middle ground at that point. There was no flexibility. And if you didn't meet it, that's a fail. Don't even bother calling the auditor and scheduling them to come in until you resolve it. Now, there is met, not met, and then there's partially met, and then there's this, you've heard about it probably with 800-171, plan of action and mitigations, this POAM, where you can say, I have it on my roadmap, I will do it, and here's the time that I will have it done by. And certain items will qualify for that type of flexibility. But the one that Mike and I talk about a lot is multi-factor authentication. If you don't have multi-factor enabled, you can't say, oh, well, we're going to get to that in 6 months. Well, no, you're not, because that will be rejected at audit time. And that's obviously going to pose a problem when you try to get contracts. There will be some things, we're working under security awareness training. We do it once a year. Maybe they'd like to see it done twice a year. We're doing testing, but we're not doing training. We're going to turn up training. We're using the government's training. We don't have good documentation. There's a lot of follow-on to that type of stuff. But I think you're going to need to target a date within the next year that says, I'm going to get certified if I want to continue in this business of selling within the defense industrial base. If you feel serious about it, if you feel that it's a vital piece of your business, you're going to have to be there. So this it's an eye chart. I'm not going to read you every line, every word, but I thought we maybe pick a couple of things out here. One of the things that's bold on here, this whole third-party assessment thing, if you're trying to compare 800-171 and, did you follow the rules on that? And did you get down the road with it and compare it to what CMMC looks like at the 2.0 level? Well, there was no third-party assessment. It was all self-assessment. It was all, and a lot of people were probably happy with that, but a lot of people were concerned, was the data really secure if it was based on a self-assessment? Now there's going to be third-party auditing, and they're going to validate that, yes, you're doing the right thing. You're going to need to provide evidence. And this doesn't mean evidence at a single point in time. We're going to talk about that probably on the next slide. But this is a repeatable, operationalized mechanism that you're going to have in place. One of the things that they've improved upon, I think, is the idea of asset management. You need to know what all your assets, and I'm not just talking about the computer in front of you, and assets, that includes data, that includes any other sort of infrastructure. That is, if you've got data hosted in a cloud server, is it in a government cloud that is certified FedRAMP? If it's not, that's probably not an appropriate place to keep CUI. A lot of people, depending on what their level is, they need GCC high for their Microsoft 365 accounts and data. That's a different level. That's run in a different data center. It's run with different support personnel, specifically to make sure that the data doesn't leak out and isn't in the hands of non-US citizens. That's an important thing. Incident response, the whole idea of if this happens, how do I respond to it? If I'm breached, if he had hit with ransomware, do I have a plan of attack, or do I run around with my hair on fire trying to figure out what to do after the fact? Those are important things that the government wants to see, so that this all goes back to the SPRS. That supplier risk rating is really important to your upstream client. They want to know that you're going to, under any circumstance, be able to provide parts to them so that they can build their widget. And if they can't, they don't want to know what your problem was. All they want to know is, when are they going to get the parts, or do they have an alternative supplier? That's really, that's why incident response is important, because you need to give them an idea of, hey, I'm down today. I'm going to guarantee you I'm going to be up tomorrow. I have an interim plan because I have this backup strategy in place, and we'll be up, it looks like, in 4 hours. There's all these mechanisms that you can use to satisfy incident response if you've planned for it. Not having a plan is pretty.
Yeah, I think a couple of things I took out of this too, Bob.
Yeah.
There's a big push in CMMC 2.0 versus 800-171 around the governance, not just the controls. Making sure that you have a full practice, and you just talked about some of those specific practices. But this is not just about checking the box on the controls anymore. It's about having them in place, having them operationalized, the governance around all of that, as opposed to strictly being able to say, yes, I have X, check it off, and move forward. Obviously, you already talked about the assessments and the big difference versus self-assessment there. But really having that detailed documentation about your maturity level and your roadmap for protecting this critical CUI and FCI. The other thing is that, in some ways, CMMC 2.0 was actually made this easier for some contractors because of the levels. Because if someone had just FCI before, they still needed to follow 800-171 in a lot of ways. And now they only have to be level 1. They don't have to follow all those level 2 practices. Or if they didn't know if they just had FCI because it was unclear, they were following 800-171. But with this new practice where everything's going to be marked, and if all they get is FCI, they've got to cover the governance around the 17 controls, not the 110 plus. So it really evolves what they're asking for.
Yeah, and part of that whole governance thing that you referred to, Mike, is, yes, I have this control covered. I have a tool in place that performs a function, but is the tool working? Is somebody monitoring the tool? Is it functioning? If it goes offline, is there an alert that happens? All of those things become critical, because what works today may not work tomorrow. And if you don't know about it, do you go 6 months without the tool working? And that becomes a failure when you go to provide evidence. Oh, look at that, the logs aren't there. Oh no. Part of having CMMC certification is having logs to depend on and rely upon if you have an issue. Just another piece. So policies. I made mention earlier that under the FCI level 1 CMMC certification, the focus is not on policies, it's on procedures and actions. When you get to CUI, they want to know that you've got policy in place, you're enforcing policy. That we can pick any of these. I talked about it before: security awareness and training policy. That policy ought to dictate exactly how often you are training personnel, not just existing personnel, but a new staff member comes on. How quickly are you going to train them? Is that within a week, 30 days? Some people say, oh, well, they'll catch it in the next cycle. Okay, that's a fail. That is not how the system is supposed to be run. and your policy ought to agree with that. It needs to be done within 30 days of someone onboarding. When you get to security awareness, not just training, but testing these folks, how often are you testing them? What happens if they fail? Are they getting more training, remedial training, we call it? Wireless network policy. Well, yeah, I got wireless. Okay, well, tell us how you're protecting that wireless. Is it using just a passphrase? Does everyone know that passphrase? Does it get changed on a frequent basis? Is that for guests or everyone? Is it just for your internal people? Do people have phones that are using it for personal use? There's a lot more to wireless network policy than those three words. That becomes a fairly big can of worms. And there's even better ways beyond traditional passwords of protecting wireless access. Password policy, we talk about this stuff every single day, it seems, and that doesn't mean you got to change your password every 30 days. The government has put out statements about this, but you need to have good password construction habits. You can't be using a 1 at the end today, and 6 months from now when you change it, you put a 2 at the end. That doesn't cut it. And they have to be substantial passwords. We're talking our go-to within our organization, 16 character minimum, and it's complex, doesn't get changed every day, every 30 days, every 60 to 90 days. It's typically once a year, once every 6 months, those types of times. But it's also protected with multi-factor so that you've got another protection in place so that if something fails, you're not having somebody get into your system unknowingly. So I think there's a lot to be said about policies and the implementations of them. This is not just, go back to Mike's comment, this is not a checkbox thing. This policy ought to be written with how you're enforcing it and how you can enforce it. You could dive into any one of these, and we talk about these a lot because people are startled to see 35 of these on a page and say, really, I have to have all of these? Well, yeah, you do. This what is underlying CMMC requirements. So everybody asks us the question, well, how long is it going to take me to get compliant? What do I have to do? What's my, what steps do I have to take? I think I'm almost there. So I should be done, like in a month or so, right? Well, a lot of people don't know where they are in relation to the CMMC guidelines. Go back to Mike's comment about, it's probably a lot easier now to figure out what level you're at. But once you figure out the level you're at, okay, am I compliant? Do I have a lot of work to do? The only way to figure that out is really with an assessment. You have to figure out, there's literally hundreds of questions that get asked to determine exactly where you stand and what gaps exist in your environment between where you need to be for certification and where you are today. 2 to 3 months, I think, that's what it typically takes. We're in the midst of 3 of them right now, of which obviously it depends on scheduling and response time from the client, but I think 60 to 90 days is a reasonable amount of time to get to that point. Then, one of the things that we typically provide as part of that assessment, we're providing remediation steps. We're telling people what the gaps are, what the problems are, if you will, and how we would suggest resolving those and remediating those. Well, let's just say for the sake of argument, there's 1 page, 8, 10, 12, 15 items that need to be resolved. No one is going to resolve those instantly. This takes planning, it takes budgeting, it takes potentially equipment replacement. We're talking to somebody that's got unsupportable equipment at this point. They rip and replace on some items. Some people have not budgeted at all for this or had some amount budgeted, but that's this year. Okay, well, we don't have enough to do the whole ball of wax this year. Let's see how we can phase it in. That's why it typically takes 12 to 18 months from day 1 all the way through to completion. So that's great. I have to hesitate every time I want to say check that box, but I've crossed the bridge and I said, yes, I've got all the gaps remediated. I've got controls in place. I've got the appropriate systems in place. I've got up-to-date software. That may be another thing. My software's outdated. It can't be fixed. It can't be patched. I need to look for something else. That may be another item that needs to change. Then you need to operationalize it. Everybody's like, what the hell does operationalize mean? Well, when the auditor comes in, they're not just going to want to know what it looks like today or at a specific point in time. And we've got vulnerability scanning up here, which is probably a really good example. I've got a few of them. Okay, show me what you've been doing over time. So vulnerability scanning, this is, typically we place an appliance on site at a client and it scans their environment and tries to determine what versions of software, what versions of operating systems, what usernames and passwords, if it can figure those out, what infrastructure, network equipment, switches, firewalls, routers, Wi-Fi, printers, all of these pieces. And then it wants to know, are they up to date? Are they running the latest software, the latest firmware? Well, that's all great at a point in time. And maybe you find out, oh, I've got to fix these 10 things because they're critical as far as the problem goes. Okay, show me you fix them. When did they exist? Do they exist today? Am I scanning every 90 days to say, this is where I started as a baseline 90 days from then? Did you fix anything? Did you hire somebody to fix it? Did you improve things? Did you add things to your environment that created more risk and more vulnerabilities? The only way to tell that is to run another scan. Okay, well, we didn't fix anything, and these 4 new items came on because something became outdated. That's why it takes 6 to 9 months of going through these example test scans and determining, okay, I scanned, I fixed, I scanned again. Okay, I've reduced my threat profile. I'm in a more secure place now. Let's see what is new out there and what's come on in the last 3 months. That's how we treat it. And we do the same thing with Active Directory audit. We want to see, make sure it's clean. Only users that are legitimate users should be in there. Well, you don't know that unless you look at it over time and compare it against where you were. And then, of course, you got to get to the audit. This certified third-party assessing organization, they're very limited today. This is they're ramping up as quickly as possible. They're getting folks trained and certified to be auditors, but to be quite honest, they don't have enough of them today to be able to run them out in the field, perform an audit, give the results, tell somebody they're certified or they have more work to do, move on to the next one. So they are training packs of these folks in order to meet the need that's coming down the line. And obviously this goes hand in hand with the ruling and the finalization of that. But that's, that takes time, and you add all this up, and could it take 2 years? Could it take 3 years? One of our clients, if they came to us today in the shape that they were in when we took them on, maybe 7 years ago, 8 years ago, it would take them 3 years, probably at minimum, to get completely up to snuff and compliant. They had a server, but they weren't running Active Directory, so anybody could just log on to the system. Well, that's awful. If you don't have Active Directory, you have no controls in place, you have no logging in place, you've got no way to prove who has access to what. Very, very loosey-goosey. So it's not crazy to say it would take 2 to 3 years. If you're far along, maybe it takes 6 to 9 months to go through the remediation process after you've got your assessment, and it's not 12 to 18, cut that in half, but you still need to go through the process of gathering evidence, providing real-time results that say, yep, we've done it this way. Patching, another great example you could use. Hey, we patch computers every single week. Prove it. Show me the system that does it. Show me the schedule that it uses. Show me the implementation. Show me the report that says, yes, no patch is missing, or one patch missing from this one system that needs to be rebooted. Okay, that's real data that's able to back up compliance. That's important. And this is we actually put this in every one of our proposals. This is how we do things. We've got a phased approach as to how we get from point A to point B. We do some discovery, we do an assessment, we look at the results of that assessment, which reveals the gaps. Okay, based on those gaps, how are we going to remediate the gaps in order to get them to a point of compliance? We build that plan to say, okay, well, it's going to take 9 months to be able to implement the remediations, and then implementation. That's the whole operationalization that we just talked about. That's I think the word daunting in the first sentence here, I think, is the most important thing. It looks daunting, and the only way we can make people feel somewhat comfortable about this is to break it down into phases like this. You got to bite this off in chunks, eat the elephant one bite at a time, whatever you want to call it. I think that's the best way of making sense of this. And it's not just biting it off in chunks with phases. What are the most important things? You look at that gap analysis that we do and come up with remediations. The plan doesn't say, oh, let's just take the cheapest stuff and the quickest stuff first. Maybe, but what's most important? Where's your biggest risk? We critical, high, medium, low. That's how we need to measure this stuff, and that's how we do it. We're not going to do the easiest thing that's not going to make an impact first just because it's easy. You can check it off the list, but have you really accomplished anything in reducing your risk? And that's really that's what you should be concerned about, number one. And quite honestly, that's what the government and your upstream contractors are concerned about. Where's their risk being created from?
Fantastic, Bob. Thank you very much for all that. We have had a few questions come in, not necessarily related to some of the content, but some of the questions people have, and we always like to say, if they ask, we answer.
Yeah.
So you mentioned system security plan, the SSP, at one point. Explain what that is a little bit for us, please.
So system security plan is one of the requirements on documenting. It's not necessarily documenting your network. It's documenting what you have that needs to be protected and the specific type of protection that you have in place. And if that system is offline, what the impact is to your organization. So yes, I've got my ERP system. Manufacturers probably at the core of their operation. Maybe that only handles scheduling and shop floor activities. Maybe it also involves quoting. Maybe it's your back office accounting system as well, because it's fully integrated. Well, what happens when that's offline? Can you make parts? Maybe. Can you quote parts? I'll go with no. If you can, the system won't know about it, number one. And number two, will it be accurate? And will it be something that you're able to provide if you do actually win the award? It's that type of concern that people want to know about. When you provide a system security plan, here are the systems, here's how I'm protecting them, here's my plan for recovery if I need to go to backup, let's say, and what I can tolerate for downtime. I think it's an important step. It is one of the requirements of CMMC at the level 2 implementation. Just like a plan of action and mitigations might be, because you don't have everything covered. Just like an SPRS score is part of the equation, You start with -203, and in a perfect world, you're at 110 for your score if you met every control and have every piece covered. All of these are components of being a certified organization.
This question came in, which we hear all the time, Bob. What is a data flow diagram? How do I create one? What do I need here? We hear it all the time, which is why I'm chuckling a little bit, because it's probably one of the least defined things out there for people. So maybe you can just share a little bit of information on that.
Yeah. So typically people don't come right out with it until you ask about it. Do you have a data flow diagram? Because it's one of the questions that gets asked during our assessment phase. And, if we were face to face with them, the glaze.
You're in the headlights.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, a data flow diagram. Nobody's ever asked me for that before. Well, the government and your upstream contractors, what do they want to know? How are you getting data? Where is it moving within your organization? I'll give you a great example of this too in a minute. How are you protecting it at each step? Is it electronic? Is it paper? If it's paper, do you have a clean desk policy where at the end of the day, everything gets locked up? There's nothing on anybody's desk that would resemble CUI or FCI, so that it's quote unquote protected. It's under wraps. Same thing with people's laptops and desktops, if you want to go that far. But it is a way of tracking how data enters and exits your organization and how you protect it along the way. My example is, we know somebody that has they take parts that they have created, and then they need to be heat treated. Well, they don't do heat treating. Okay. Well, they take the box of parts, put them in a truck, their own truck potentially, and they've got some paperwork that says, here's what you need to do with them, and this is why. Okay. Now you've not only moved parts outside of your control, you've given them to somebody else who hopefully is doing the right thing, but you've given them documentation that says, here, this is how we need the part to be heat treated. This is what the parts are. This is what they're used for. Okay, that's all CUI. Now, it's out in the wild. Maybe it's being controlled, but guy that drives the truck pulls into Dunkin' Donuts, goes inside, gets a coffee, the truck gets stolen. What happens? You've just released that stuff into the wild. There has to be controls in place. For me, I wouldn't. There's no stopping. There's probably electronic transmission of that documentation as opposed to the papers, going off with the parts. There's got to be controls along the way, and because that's data and it's flowing outside your organization. During the audit, they're going to want to follow the bouncing ball to figure out where the data is at all times. The easiest way to answer this, and I'm not saying it's easy to do, but the easiest way to provide documentation is to hand that diagram over to the auditor and say, here, this is how data moves around. And they will appreciate it, number one. And I think they will get a very good idea of how much of a handle you have on things if you can provide that piece.
Yeah, I mean, the things we see in there is, how do they receive it? Email, fax, secure, whatever, right? How do they store it when it's stored? Are those areas protected? How is it transmitted throughout your organization?
Yeah.
How does it transmitted outside of your organization? And
we don't even have to go to that level. You just went to storage. Okay. You downloaded it. Let's say you got it in a secure manner. You got it via encrypted email. You downloaded it from a secure portal at your client's location. Great. What did you do with it? Oh, I saved it to my server. Your server encrypted? I don't know. Is it? These are the types of questions right alongside with data flow that we talk about and hear about, because that's what the expectation is. That's how people are expecting you to protect the data. And I think that's important to know.
Yeah. I'll do one more question here and give everybody a little bit of time back. But obviously we get this one a lot, so it's not shocking that it showed up here. We show all these things about assessments and remediations, et cetera, et cetera.
How much does it cost?
How much does it cost? What's it gonna, I'm a small manufacturer. What's it gonna cost me to become compliant with CMMC 2.0 level 2?
Yeah, so if you're at the level 2, it's fairly common. We quote these probably a couple of times a week. 15,000, 20,000 gets you an assessment and gets you mediation, gets you the gap list, remediation, planning. It gets you to the point where decisions can be made to say, okay, I'm holding this document in my hand, or at that point, group of documents in my hand. It's all been explained to me. I understand it, not necessarily to the bits and bytes level, but I understand what I need to do. And now we got to figure out over what time. And that, that timing could affect pricing or whatever's coming down the line. But is it reasonable to think that it's going to be, 25,000 to 100,000 to implement all the systems and controls? Is it really a project like that, or is it an onboarding project that we do where we bring them on and implement the security at a certain investment per user, $250 per user per month, that type of thing is a good baseline to use for all the controls and all the testing and reporting and all the implementation that goes along with it. I think those are fairly normal as to what we see. When you're 15 to 75 to 100 user environments, I think that's pretty normal. Maybe it even reaches beyond that, 125, 150 users, but I think those numbers are what we see. And I know those are big ranges, but until you do an assessment and understand where you are and how you stack up and what's really missing, you can't really understand what the investment's going to be and how far away from the finish line you are. You may say, oh yeah, I think I'm in great shape. Okay, well, do you have advanced threat detection? Do you have multi-factor on login, multi-factor on email? Do you have some sort of DNS filtering to protect wandering around on the internet from a filtering standpoint, and also checking whether websites haven't been compromised? What's your backup system? Can you turn a server or servers back on at a moment's notice if your production one fails? Is it encrypted everywhere? Do you have copies off site automatically every single day? Is it tested? I could go on and on with all the pieces that make that up, because the controls at the CUI level, they're significant volume of them. There's,
So
110.
to summarize that, right? An assessment, you're probably looking at 15 to 20,000 for a moderate sized organization. Remediation is really the biggest wild card because it all depends upon where you're starting. If you had everything in place for 800, 171 properly, that number is going to be on the low side. If you're starting from scratch, that number is going to be on the high side, that $25,000 to $100,000 worth of remediation project work. And then the ongoing, it's an ongoing compliance. So you're looking at that $250, $300 a user ongoing per month to make sure that you're continuing to keep that compliance in place, keep the testing up to date, operationalizing all those components.
Yeah, and I think, if you were trying to, boil that down to level one, the numbers are going to be significantly less because a lot of the same controls don't apply at that level. When we're talking about, 17 versus 110, obviously you can see a magnitude of difference. Yes, some things are still required. You still need to protect the data properly. You need to be able to monitor. You need to be able to have controls. But at the end of the day, having that assessment done on the front end will give you a really good idea of where you stand.
Absolutely. The assessment's the great place to start. If you're not quite at the assessment level yet, we are offering a CMMC preparedness checklist. Doesn't cover everything, but it's sort of a starting point of all those really hot ticket items I'm gonna ask Brandon to throw a copy of the link for this into into the chat so that people can get that as they're before they leave here today. And that's available on our website as well. So anybody who's interested in downloading a checklist to understand where you are today, that's available for free for attendees for today. And other than that, I think we're wrapped up here. Want to thank everybody for showing up today, for spending their lunch hour with us. Bob, thank you for all the great information. Brandon from ImageWorks, thank you so much for all the hard work you do to help put all this content together and promote it out to the world and get this information into the hands of the organizations that really need it. That's why we're in business. We're here to try to help protect those organizations, keep them operationally efficient, and reduce their risk. So thank you, everybody, for your time today, and look forward to seeing you at the next one.